Hey everyone, it's Chad,
It's Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. Alright, to start out our seventh episode on ethno-nationalism, I'd like to recap some of which we did in our last ones. So we started out the series defining ethno-nationalism and defining some of the divisions between what is civic and what is cultural nationalism. And then going from that, we described various ethno-nationalist figures in the past, such as Hitler, Mussolini, and then got to more modern ones such as Vladimir Putin, Slobodan Milosevic, and then Xi Jinping of China. And so today, with this episode, we're going to be starting off with a modern but again not as well known ethno-nationalist leader, and that is Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. So Turkey is one of the reasons that makes it kind of go beyond recognition often is because Turkey is a Western ally. It's part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it often, well, it kind of flip-flops between being aligned with the West and sometimes with Russia. But some of the ethno-nationalist policies of Erdogan become kind of overlooked or just not recognized on the world stage. But in this video, we'd like to sort of outline them and really go, not outline them, but go in depth on what he's doing and why it is important. So, for Erdogan, in summary, what he's trying to do is to reclaim what he sees as Turkey's right to the past lands of the Ottoman Empire, and we'll kind of go into this a little later. But along with reclaiming lands of the, like ideologically reclaiming some of the lands of the Ottoman Empire, another thing that Turkey is really aiming to do is really clamp down on the ethnic group called the Kurds. And so this is a group that lives in various different countries that we have in the Middle East, such as in Turkey and Syria, Iraq, Iran, and it's kind of spread out between those four and kind of other ones, but it doesn't have its own country. And that is because this group has been marginalized by every one of those countries and has never, since the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, it's never had its own state. And so with Turkey, the goal of Erdogan and of the Turkish state is the repression of this group because, in their words, for security reasons and terrorist reasons. But objectively, his goal is to really create a homogenous group in Turkey and a more homogenous religious group for Turkey going forward. And I like this quote that um, came from the New York Times on that basically just summarizes some of his actions and what they kind of mean and how it leads to, how we could say he's an ethno-nationalist. So the quote goes, Mr. Erdogan's war in northern Syria is an ethno-nationalist attack on Kurdish people and their aspirations, and an attempt at using Turkish military might to engineer demographic changes on land that belongs to more than one nation. And for background, it's mentioning the Syrian civil war in which Turkey is playing a part in combating the Kurdish independent, well, kind of self-appointed independent state in northeastern Syria. It's called Rojava, I believe. I probably butchered the name,
It's
but
Rojava.
Rojava, yeah. And Turkey's role in fighting against this country. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we're going to start this one off.
Right. So, good thing to understand about the history of the Ottoman Empire is, first of all, just how big it was. You know, about the similar, rhetoric that you've heard from Mussolini, looking back at the Roman Empire, and Hitler looking back at the German Empire before World War One and during World War One, when it had a lot of influence throughout big areas, and then reduced to a smaller area. You have the biggest extent of the Ottoman Empire, which stretched again through like a third of Europe into parts of modern day Ukraine and Russia, you know, and then through the Caucasus region, Caucasia, much of the Middle East with the border, actually into modern day Iran, surrounding the modern day state of Saudi Arabia, but having a lot of influence within the Arab region, controlling the choke point of the of what is today the vital trade route of the Suez Canal, and then controlling a large part of North Africa, north of the Sahara Desert. So it had a big swath of control, in this region, and to be reduced to, if you can see my cursor, um, this area around here, which is Turkey today, is quite insulting in some ways to someone who is very appealing to history, someone who appeals to history, to a nationalist like Erdogan. This was roughly around the end of the 17th century, like 1683 or something. This was the biggest extent of the Ottoman Empire in which Turkey had a dominant control over. And this was 1914, at the beginning of World War One, and after centuries of being like pushed over and being cut into by other imperial states, in the constant like jockeying of control between empires, and where it still had control over parts of Arabia, still had influence within Arabia, still had control over modern day Syria and parts of modern day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, um, but it's obviously shrunk, if you can see from the map here between this and this. So by the time that World War One had ended, the Ottoman Empire had been beaten to the point of extinction, in where the modern day nation of Turkey need to be drawn up along this line right here, like a little bit north of the city of Aleppo and Mosul, around over here, where they would lose all their control over these lands around here in the modern day countries of Iraq and Syria, in where the allied nations of France and Britain would actually take over those areas that used to be under their control, after saying in the 14 points, the condition upon which the Paris Peace Conference was signed, that um, that they would not do so, that all nations would have their own degree of self-autonomy, and they would be independent. This also technically included the Kurdish, the ethnically Kurdish population, which sits around here in this region of eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and northeastern modern day Syria. And so, now that they are all their own three separate nations and not part of the same empire, and although under the Ottoman Empire there had always been a certain amount of anti-Kurdish sentiment, because they did not assimilate with the majority Turkic, in Arab communities around them, they'd always been kind of fucked over a little bit by those people, and so they live around here, and parts of those ethnic minorities live in other nations, whether it be Iraq, Syria, or Turkey. And the conditions of World War One said that they would have their own state, but that never happened. And so it's been this constant struggle for independence up until this day. And Erdogan has been severely clamping down on it.
Yeah, and so that's what we see even now on and off. We have Turkey incurring into northern Syria and attacking the Kurdish independence autonomous state of Rojava. And as we said, this is the state that the Kurdish people were trying to establish, and they did so during the chaos of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2012. They used that to establish an autonomous state and kind of create a place where the Kurdish people could finally have their own land. Because as we said, over their entire history, the Kurdish people never had a land, and even after the dissolvement of the Ottoman Empire, the Kurdish people never had a state. Um, But in the Syrian civil wars, what we have is Erdogan launching offensives and bombing Kurdish military and civilians in this enclave in northern Syria in order to eliminate this place as a as a legitimate state. The reason that they do this, rhetorically, is because they see the Kurdish people, or they see the Kurdish state over there as supporting a terrorist group which operates within Turkey. It's the PKK, I believe, um, which Turkey uses as the reason to be clamping down on the Kurdish population. Um, and so, like I said, what you have is the kind of scapegoat. And there's a good map. So as you see in northeastern Syria is the Kurdish. What we have the Kurdish autonomous state of Rojava, and you have Turkey on the north launching both airstrikes and ground offensives into this area in order to systematically remove them from the area and remove them as a state because they see their autonomy as a threat to the Kurdish nation.
Oh, you mean to the Turkish nation?
Turkish nation, yeah.
Right. And so Erdogan's um, scapegoating, of the Kurdish people as supporting terrorist groups, and some people they argue over their designation as terrorist groups, but the Syrian civil war and the chaos that it brought about over there, um, Turkey and Erdogan particularly, as he gained much more totalitarian, authoritarian control over Turkey, essentially made the unanimous decision. You know, I mean, it made the personal decision, with a fair amount of support, by the Turkish population to intervene in Syria and to not necessarily annex territory, not with that intention, at least not publicly, but to create a safe boundary between the chaos in Syria and the Turkish border to make sure that there was no lone drone strike, or some shell that accidentally hits a Turkish civilian's house. That was his excuse. But as you can see here, like with his as we'll continue to explain his sentiment towards Kurdish autonomy, and the fact that there is a Kurdish um, rump state, Rojava, being largely established, from the chaos of the Syrian civil war and his actions being taken in this particular region. You get the idea that this really is an excuse. He just doesn't like the idea of Kurds having a nation. He doesn't like the idea of them having a nation south of his border that might attack Turkey if given the chance.
Yeah. And then combining them rhetorically with that terrorist group, they just see them, their whole existence as a threat. And so we have that external opposition to the Kurdish people, but we also have that existing internally in the Turkish state. So after one of the Turkish assaults into the area of northern Syria, 78 people were investigated for their social media posts in which they used the slogan "No to war, peace now" during a political meeting. A Turkish court ruled that the slogan constitutes as propaganda for a terrorist organization. And so here what you have is Erdogan's clamping down of anyone associated with any sort of terrorist group, which usually would have just been designated as the Kurds. Anyone supporting that group would be in prison and convicted for this kind of um, it would be convicted for being a security threat. And again, that's what so many of these ethno-nationalists or just authoritarians use throughout the world to persecute various minorities. This is what China does with the Uyghur population. They say that their separatism or their otherness can be a threat of terrorism. Um, and so you get that scapegoating again of saying that this separate group who is different from the majority of the nation um, is a threat to the nation. And so that's what we have with the Kurdish people once more. We have them all um, being grouped in with the terrorist group, and then their whole existence of their outsider state to be just an extension of a terrorist threat. And so with that, you have is Erdogan's very eager moves to eliminate that entire state and that entire people from that area.
Right. Because it's also important to know with Erdogan that he is he is the in the past 100 years, since the establishment of the modern Turkish state and its first ruler, Ataturk, the his nickname, Father of the Turks, his name was Mustafa Kemal. Um, Ever since his reign over Turkey about 100 years ago, um, um, Turkish leaders have been very secular, especially in comparison to their Ottoman Empire that had existed before then. That was obviously very non-secular. That was very Islamic. It spread a lot of its Islamic views into a lot of the areas that they conquered in Europe, particularly. Um, and But it's also good to know that it's important to know that Erdogan is kind of the exception in the modern era. That he is doing what other modern leaders of Turkey have not really done. That he's like clamping down on it more than other Turkish leaders had dared to do in the modern era. Um, and Yeah, but there is a quote here that I want to read off that makes the point that the history of anti-Kurdish military nationalism in Turkey is a lot older than Erdogan. So I believe this is from New York Times quote. Um, Quote, goes back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. While Kurdish autonomy was suggested in the first post war treaty, those terms were renegotiated after the Turkish War of Independence and set the borders of modern Turkey and left the Kurds without a self ruled region. Colonial mapmaking divided Kurdish regions between the Turkish, British, and French mandated states of Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Kurds ended up being persecuted minorities in each of these countries. In the eyes of the Turkish state, the Kurds didn't exist. Their names were replaced with Turkish names, language was banned, music criminalized, and existence denied. Kurds were forcefully assimilated into being Turkish. Large Kurdish populations in Turkey fled to neighboring Syria during violent Turkification campaigns in the first half of the 20th century. In Syria, Kurds were forced into a precarious existence, ideologically driven by pan-Arabism policies. In post-independence Syria denied citizenship to Kurds in the northeast, rendering their entire community stateless. Stamped out between Turkification and Arabization, stateless for the Kurds means much more than the simple lack of a Kurdish nation state. It means the lack of basic protection from any of the states they naturally inhabit. When my father was born, his mother tongue was a crime. Until 1991, the Kurdish language was officially forbidden in Turkey, which made speaking, writing, or listening to Kurdish illegal. In my father's Yazidi Kurdish village in Turkey, every day students in his school would have to read an oath that ended with the line, "My existence shall be dedicated to Turkish existence." The oath was recited in schools until 2013. My parents were university students in Ankara. When in another part of Kurdish geography, another state attacked the Kurdish right to exist. Saddam Hussein launched a genocidal campaign against Kurds in northern Iraq in 1988. Tens of thousands ran to the Turkish border to escape annihilation. And so, end quote. It's a very, very long quote. I honestly was not expecting that quote to be so long, but the history of anti-Kurdism is basically of being surrounded on all sides by people that hate them and do not want them to exist. And um, And
Yeah, it
yeah,
just underlines just again how anti-Kurdish sentiment doesn't just exist in Turkey. It exists also in Iraq and Syria. And Iraq is one that all again isn't mentioned very often, because Saddam Hussein in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War launched various different attempts at ethnically cleansing the Kurds from their area in northwestern Iraq. Used chemical weapons, ballistic missiles, sent in squads to murder entire villages. And so we have persecution not just in Turkey, but in all the areas that the Kurdish people just live in. And so again, as Erdogan, while Erdogan is the biggest proponent of this idea when it comes to the Kurdish people, in his views of ethno-nationalism, it's not the first, and it's just another on a long line of persecution that these people have had to face just over history.
right. So an agreement of whether or not the Kurds deserve a nation is really between three nations and not one, which makes the situation even harder to deal with. Because, like, sure, they might be able to exploit the opportunity coming from the Syrian civil war to create their own state, which is literally what the experiment of Rojava is in northeastern Syria. But to have a state that is largely made up around the ethnic borders or regions of which the Kurds inhabit around Turkey and Iraq is probably going to be impossible. So, yeah, but the thing is, moving away from Erdogan, um, we also want to look at Modi because Modi is probably the first example of someone who can be considered a dangerous authoritarian nationalist, who is also, in some cases, an ally of the US.
Yeah,
But their persecution and their allowance of terrible policies against the minority Muslim people is not necessarily along ethnicity. And so while it is horrible, it's terrible, and genocide may even be likely to occur in a short time soon, in a nation like India and where there is a lot of Hindu nationalism. It cannot quite be called ethno-nationalism according to the strict definition of it.
yeah,
And
yeah. And so the issue of India is one that's again just very complicated. But as we could see recently, um, the sentiments of Modi are coming close to ethno nationalism. But as of now, how it is is sort of a religious nationalism. India is a majority, I believe, Hindu nation, and while throughout India, of course, it's one of the most populous countries in the world. While it has a majority Hindu population, there are still Muslims throughout the country, who were kind of split between India and Pakistan. That's the major division between those areas. India's majority Hindu, Pakistan's majority Muslim, but you still have groups in between the two countries, and especially in the region of Kashmir, which is northeastern India, northwestern Pakistan, that's kind of being divided between the two countries. But what you have in India is more so a promotion of the Hindu culture and the reopening of different religious facilities, and then the what's somewhat ramping up of persecution of the Muslim minority throughout the country. And it was interesting when we were doing our research, we saw Modi being compared to Erdogan, and the source we looked at, it did so in looking how both of these leaders took what countries were originally very secular and how they led um, their countries, and are now turning them into very religiously charged nationalist, if not ethno-nationalist countries. And so we have a quote from one of our articles over here that reads, quote, "The two men, Modi and Erdogan, come from humble beginnings and have cast themselves as political outsiders whose bids for power would reshape their countries not only the next decade, but for the next century. Uh, Another quote in here. Both have personality cults around them. And this is a quote from Samantha Bowes, the author of Secular States, Religious Politics. And again, this will be in the description. Um, both of these leaders have a sense of themselves as the men of destiny. And so, in both of these nations, in Turkey and India, you have these leaders who are trying to um, somewhat reclaim again some of their old greatness. For Turkey, it was the Ottoman Empire, and regain the glory and somewhat of the land that they used to have. With India, it's a lot more of the promotion of the Hindu culture in the framing of it as that being the destiny of the nation, of that being the future of the nation, of India being a Hindu state. And so there again, you see a lot of the promotion of Hinduism at the expense of the Muslim minority, which again still exists, even though Pakistan is, next to the country. There are still minority of Muslim populations within India who's are kind of suffering under the policies of Modi.
Right, because when it's important to understand with India, for example, and particularly with its history, that when it became independent um, um, from Britain, it was actually a lot larger than the modern Indian nation is today. That the colonial state of India included also what is today modern Pakistan, and its independence included the condition that was decided upon then, that they should be split between the religious fervor that may come between the two of them, of Hindus in India and Muslims in Pakistan, and that's the way how the lines were drawn up. Now, this, of course, brought a lot of what is it? Forced migrations of people across borders, and where a lot of people died. It was a very deadly, very terrible affair. That many people that can trace their memory, their um, genetic memory back over to that area. They can hear like stories in their families of how traumatic that experience was. But that created the conditions for which Modi would exploit that Hindu nationalism today in India. So um, that is also a very important thing to consider. But with Modi, you see a theme that's similar with Turkey that I forgot to mention with Erdogan, and that is quote from the from the Atlantic article End of the Secular Republic, that in Turkey, the loudest criticisms of the conversion have come from outside the country, and however, this is also at least partly due to Erdogan's muzzling of the press over time, end quote. And so this one is more particularly leading over to Erdogan, because I forgot to mention it when we were talking about Erdogan, and this is referring to a conversion of an old Christian monastery in Istanbul, the big city in Turkey. Um, um, and it used to be a Christian monastery during the time of which it was ruled by the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and then it was taken over by the Ottoman Empire, turned into a mosque for about 500 years, and then Ataturk, the first leader of the modern Turkish state, turned it into a museum. And in a historical move back in 2020, 2021, around there, Erdogan turned it back into a mosque, a practicing mosque, and where people living in the area could go in there and practice their faith rather than just see it as it was a museum. And so, um, interesting though, forgot to mention about him is that because of his muzzling of the press, as the Atlantic article explains, um, it all of the criticisms of him are going to be abroad, because if you're speaking against him in Turkey, you're going to get imprisoned. But that also has the added propaganda effect for Erdogan of saying that the critiques to domestic policy of Turkey and make it seem like conspiracies against the political independence of the nation, which is a common theme not just used by Erdogan, but by all people, whether it be Modi or Duda or Orban. And they say that if you don't like what we're doing in this nation and you're trying to get us to stop, oh, and by the way, Xi Jinping likes to do this too.
Oh,
Um,
without a doubt.
yeah,
A
like
lot
basically,
of authoritarian leaders use it actually. Even going back to Mussolini and Hitler, Mussolini cited the West's opposition to them gaining land in the 1919 peace treaty as some sort of conspiracy against the Italian people. And so you get authoritarians using opposition and painting that as some sort of global conspiracy that's trying to thwart, not just their own agenda, but they bring it all the way out to the will of the people. And that's because in their states, their people, because of the lack of the freedom of the press and the stamping down of opposition, all you see is the support. You see the support of Erdogan's policy within Turkey, and even exterior. You go on like YouTube comments, there's a lot of propaganda that gets spread. Same with China. But all that the leaders see is support, and all they see from the outside is anger or some people who look like they're trying to take them down. And so that's a common theme that these authoritarians seek to use. You keep
right.
going. Yeah.
Modi has been the leader of India for about the past 8 years. And in that time, the Hindu nationalism has increased because of his affiliation with the BJP party, which is a rejuvenation of an old party in India under colonial rule that was very anti-Muslim and actually supported the racial pride. And if you could see me, you could see the words
See the air quotes.
racial pride of Hitler and Mussolini as fascist states. And so, considering that the BJP party, of which Modi is a member of, and I think even leader of right now in India, that it's a rejuvenation of a party that in the 20s and the 30s looked upon fascist nations and their dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, as being examples of racial pride, um, and and would engage in actual martial training exercises publicly back in those 20s and 30s era. And I believe even so today. I don't they have that also today?
I believe I've heard something of this sort.
Like the party has its own army, which
Yeah.
which
Which,
is
again,
very,
very big red flag when a party
yeah,
has an armed military force and sure their will. Where have we seen that before?
right. And so in the city of New Delhi, there are, and not just in New Delhi, but all around the country, like you have examples of burning Muslims alive or burning their crops or killing their animals, or just ransacking their houses, burning down their buildings, you know,
Terrorism.
killing families, in angry mobs, throughout the city. There was even an example of Trump visiting New Delhi once, and I think it was 2019, in where like he was flown in to a certain section of the city, and at that same time, New Delhi had been in a religious riot for 3 days, in where the army did not stop the people from killing, burning, people, property, and businesses that were led by Muslims. And so we'll expand on this later. We're coming to the end of our time, but we hope that we've explained to you that Xi Jinping, Erdogan, and Modi are ethno-nationalists, or with Modi, not so much so, much more religious nationalists. But anyway, we are the
Good
Marches of
points.
Truth, and we'll see you next time.
Have a good one, everyone.